this, I'll call, I don't know, the after party, maybe? And really also thank you to, I guess, Waterfront Alliance for putting on a really great program through this conference and giving many a platform to talk about many wonderful topics, including this one. And over wine, no less. Been to a lot of conferences, not a lot of wine. So, and I should talk into this. All right. So, you know, as Farhana has mentioned, we'll be talking about stormwater. Just to maybe do some quick introductions. My name is, as it says here, I'm Patrick Parault with AKRF. I have a background in civil engineering. I'm a professional engineer, working in the space for about 25 years. And I'm joined here by also my wonderful panelists. To my left, I'm going to get this right, is Bob Schuster. He's the director of New Jersey DEP's Watershed Protection and Restoration, overseeing its stormwater program. We also have Jamie Ong, an environmental protection project manager at New York City Parks, and coordinates wetlands restoration and watershed planning. And then last but not least, we have Mohammed Khan, senior water resources engineer at NV5, where he leads the design of stormwater management practices for highway projects and beyond. So please give us, the folks here, a warm welcome. You'll see their full bios in the program. Clearly just sort of went through this quickly here. So just to set the stage here, and I have notes just to help me keep honest. And so I won't spend a lot of time here because we want to hear from our lovely panel here. But yes, indeed, we're here to talk about stormwater. And stormwater effectively is, you know, it flows into our waterways or into sewer systems or into different types of infrastructure designed to help manage that water, such as rain gardens, and we heard earlier about blue belts. But when stormwater hits our highways, that runoff often collects oil, sediment, trash, debris, heavy metals as well, that can effectively turn that water into like a stream of pollutants. And because highways span such vast areas across different terrains, topographies, different environments, and also cutting through different jurisdictional lines, it's not just a technical challenge to help manage it, but also a collaboration that requires coordination across multiple agencies. So we'll explore some of those challenges as well as opportunities, and discuss how, you know, we can collaborate to improve how we manage stormwater, and especially from highways through this group. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Bob. Hopefully you can get us started. I think this works. So I sort of quickly set the stage here, but, you know, looking to see if you can help maybe walk us through and better understand how we know that we have a problem, or the scale of it, if you could.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to basically start by going through some slides that give an very general overview and background from a state perspective, but also leading into the other components and speakers.
And can everybody hear us? Okay, just making sure. That's all.
So essentially where we come from in the state, most states, we all have programs, we all collect water quality. There's data that's collected across the state. They get used for the integrated report. We have to do this for EPA requirements, and we define impairments. What we know in New Jersey when it comes to stormwater, we have a very big component, 60%, is basically non-point source pollution and stormwater runoff that causes our impairments. So this is an issue, whether it's highways, municipalities, generally speaking, that's what we're seeing. We also have a permit program that does a lot of the, you know, MS4 for municipal, for industrial, but we also have highway agency permit that I'm sure you'll hear more about. So generally speaking, you know, we do the integrated report, we do TMDLs, we try to improve water quality. That's one of the goals, is restoration. Take all of our water quality data, find out where we can restore things and do work. But a lot of the times, how do you how do you take all of that data and utilize it? We could look at AI, artificial intelligence to use it. We could also, look, some of the things I mentioned, technology to use that can get large amounts of data that we can collect and use as screening tools, and get through that on how to get to where to do the work. How do you take this broad scale data and drill down to where do you do restoration, where do you do the work?
Oh, is it going?
Yeah. There we go. So I will, let's see if there's one I missed. Yeah, skipped over a couple, it was slow.
Is it only going forward?
I'm going back.
Oh, okay.
All right, yeah, all right, so it had the right one. It's just a little slow to get there. So one of the things that I did here, this was an example of nitrate taking a lot of that data. You take a lot of information that we have. In the case of New Jersey, this is in Ocean County. I will tell you, in Ocean County, New Jersey, we have, generally speaking, for water quality, about one station for every 1.5 square miles over a 20-year period. That's a lot of information. But what do you do with that information? How do you use it? Looking at, say, nitrate, because we're working on a Barnegat Bay TMDL for nitrogen, if you look at nitrate, the main load in the system from the freshwater side, we have color-coded things as yellow, that is like, this is above the TMDL threshold we'd like to see. Red is more than double that threshold. And green, it's well below the threshold. And when we look at a lot of the information, we could have a white circle up top and a white circle at the bottom. That's one stream 6 miles apart, and one is green and one is yellow. There's no station in between. There's a lot of things going on in between those 2 points. So that would be an area that you'd want to target. You could also see in the bigger yellow circle, that large area of a lot of yellow. That's where we're exceeding that TMDL threshold. And that would be an area of concern. So if we're going to talk about whether it's municipal, county roads, highways, when you look at this area, let's see if the next, if you look at that same yellow area, this is a map of every stormwater outfall that is in that yellow area. So where we have TMDL thresholds exceeded, all of the red dots are municipalities, all the purple are highway agency. So if you're looking at it from a highway agency or a municipal perspective and you know you have a problem in that big area, where do you start? How do you even begin to look at that information and say, where do we start with our projects and how do we utilize and make the best restoration plans that we can? One of the ways, use of, these are older photos, automatic samplers. You can set these to trigger on flow, on depth, on many different things to get samples throughout a hydrograph. It's something that we've utilized. This was an example of utilizing it, seeing how nutrients changed throughout a hydrograph at a location that was right by a highway agency outfall. This was an example that I pulled. It shows that you get that first flush. The concentrations are really high in the first flush. As the hydrograph climbs, concentrations drop. So we know we have a very localized effect that responds very fast, and that was by the highways. So that is something how you can utilize some of the information. This same highway, we zeroed in and did more stations than just one. And we collected a bunch of samples using the samplers. And again, you could see, looking at this parameters, you could see that before a storm event, the low bar graph, and what happens on first flush early in the events. The one with the really big bar, you could see we had a very small bar at the beginning. That was an outfall that was right there. So what we were measuring for years at the lowest station throughout our study we're finding out was coming from, the primary part of it was coming from one of those outfalls. So this is an area that now you could say, we want to focus on that area. That's where the remediation efforts should take place first to get the most out of whatever money gets spent for your remediation. We also have used continuous water quality monitors, whether they're buoys. This is just an example from a lake. This is to study harmful algal blooms. And what we saw, these are all outfalls around that lake. So when we put our buoy at the very low portion of the lake, right in the middle, somewhere right around there, we would see that as a surrogate using phycocyanin pigment on the sensor, which is the blue line, that is our sensor for phycocyanin as a surrogate for harmful algae. You could see that when we went dry, all those bars are rainfall amounts. When we would go dry, you'd start to see a dip in the algal response. But every time we had a little bit of rainfall, that level went up and responded. So what this is telling us, all of those outfalls are contributing stormwater runoff under rain events, getting to the lake, throwing in nutrients that are driving that harmful algal bloom. So there's highways that go by that lake, there's municipal roads that go by that lake, there's a lot that goes on around that lake. Just to finish off, we have our last, we also do this remote sensing for flyovers. So we're able to fly over those lakes with an aircraft and say, not only do we have that point, but how much of the lake does that cover? The one in the middle is Lake Hopatcong. That's where we're able to say it's by those edges. So that's really what we're looking at from a broader scale perspective on how do we look from the broad scale perspective of taking data, going back, looking at all of that information to drive where we restore and do the remediation efforts that need to get funded in the right spots under the right conditions. Because there's only so much money to go around to do that work.
Right. Great, thanks. And hopefully we can get this to work out. And appreciate the sort of bringing this from a watershed level view. But I've got to imagine too, and we can talk about the data, I'm sure we're going to get to that later. But I'm sure that this isn't a certainly unique thing that we're seeing here, I mean, from New Jersey's perspective. But maybe, Jamie, you could talk to New York City and what Parks is seeing in terms of runoff and stormwater management, if we can get to that.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely absolutely agree with a lot of the work that you've been doing, and really appreciate having you kind of tee up the work that you've done with the state and think about the work that we're doing here in New York City as a municipality. And to kind of set the stage for that conversation, I'd like to talk about the fact that there's a couple of studies, you know, this conversation is not new. And as I'm referencing this, am I pointing the wrong way? Oh, there we go. All right. So again, the conversation's not new. There's a couple of reports that, you know, have informed a lot of the work that we've been doing here at New York City Parks. One is the Regional Plan Association report, so that was out in 2021, and that looks at New York City's 32,000 acres of roadways and looks at that right of way and understands how we can use that to activate not only for flood prevention and for climate adaptation, but also for alternative transportation, improved movement of goods, and then also expanded access to economic activity. And so this plan characterized those roadways into three different types based on their use. And it's an analogy, it's a precursor to a lot of the work that we're talking about now in terms of this one focusing on the right of way, but now we're moving to our highways, our parkways, and our expressways, and thinking about how we can manage the runoff from that as well. I also want to mention the Design Trust for Public Space and their partnership with the Department of Transportation. And so they were looking at elevated spaces, our elevated roadways and highways, and how to come up with strategies to reclaim and transform those public spaces. So there's a very robust community engagement process that they went through, and they also did pilot projects in Sunset Park beneath the BQE, Long Island City below the Queensboro Bridge, and then this is a picture from the Rockaways along below the A train where they installed the dunescape planter, so evoking that landscape of the Rockaways, but then also using it to capture stormwater from the elevated A line. All right, so then I get into a little bit of the technical aspect of our work, right? A lot of it, when we're looking at stormwater management, we have to think about climate projections. And so I'm so very grateful for the International Panel for Climate Change, but also the New York City Panel for Climate Change, because they're taking the global projections and applying it to New York City. And so there's a report out by an interdisciplinary team of academics and professionals. They worked with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, and they looked at climate change vulnerability impacts and adaptations. And so this report provides data on coastal flooding, extreme rainfall, and heat. I'm focusing here on rainfall in particular, and they took the BWSO, DEP's Bureau of Water and Sewer Operations, their 24-hour symmetric hyetograph. So that's what they used to design New York City sewers, and used it as a baseline for analyzing rainfall projections. And so these projections are looking at, you can see from that chart above, right? So they're looking at 24-hour rainfall depths and finding that for a 10-year storm, these rainfall depths could increase from 28 to 35%, starting from 2050 to 2099, based on these projections. And so there's two levels of projections here, right? You can see the 245 and the 585 scenario, and that difference is 245 is if we were successful in meeting our climate mitigation targets, and then the higher one is if we, the more conservative ratio scenario where we may not meet those targets. And so you can even see illustrated here that increase. I mean, the hyetograph shown here is looking at intensity over duration, right? And illustrates in the solid line our present day, in like the closer together dotted line is the scenario where we would meet our climate targets, and then the larger dashes are where we would not meet those targets. And you can see that severe significant difference between what we're planning for now and what we need to plan for in the future. And then this is also, all of this information went into the New York City Panel on Climate Change report. They have their 4th assessment that's been out, and then they are working on their 5th assessment. And so I wanted to include this image as a way for us to reframe or focus on the fact that we have historical landscapes like our marine systems, our wetlands, and our streams, and how that overlaid or next to our flood hazard areas, as well as our extreme stormwater flood areas, and how all of those areas are often, the same places. Where we have our historical wetlands and streams are where we have our flooding now. And so I'll focus a little bit more about New York City Parks' work. Let's see, just making you all blink. So this is a picture of Forest Barrel Marsh in Brooklyn. And so Forest Barrel Marsh is lovely because it's named after 4 different types of sparrows, and it's wonderful that you can find an environment like that in New York City. And 2 of the sparrows that it's named after are rare and threatened. And so it's an important landscape just from a marsh restoration and protection perspective. But at the same time, it's bounded by the Belt Parkway. And you can kind of see, like way back in the background of this photo, is the Marine Parkway Bridge, or the Marine Park Bridge. And when they expanded that highway, they increased the impervious area, and they routed that increase of stormwater into the marsh. And so they ended up installing a new outfall. So there was one outfall already existing. They installed another outfall, and that was installed in 2017. And so what we did was, there was pre-treatment. There were a couple of stormwater basins, infiltration basins that were installed upstream or upline from the outfalls. But we also wanted to kind of study what the impacts of that additional stormwater runoff is. And so there are very significant stormwater impacts on our wetlands. And we at New York City Parks try to mitigate these impacts or even avoid these scenarios, right? But because this was happening, this is an opportunity for us to be able to study what the impacts were. And so we found that there were erosion impacts, there are water quality impacts from, well, just generally stormwater impacts in general. We have erosion concerns, but we also have water quality impacts from increased nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, which promotes the growth of plants that are generally overabundant, like Phragmites. And so that is a problem that we need to manage in our marshes. It also results in harmful algal blooms, like Bob was explaining. And then the increased fresh water into a tidal system like these marshes, it reduces the salinity. It increases marsh erosion and loss, the loss of the elevation of the marsh, and then that ends up making them more susceptible to or vulnerable to sea level rise impacts. So in terms of the data that we found from our study here, we found we installed erosion pins, so they're pins in the marsh, and then we measured kind of the distance to vegetation from those pins. And so from 2019 to 2021, we found that the vegetated edge of the marsh receded 31 centimeters. So that's over 3 years. 31 centimeters, I actually don't know what that is in feet. Maybe somebody else knows. That's one of the PDH questions. Yeah, so even in a short amount of time, you are observing that loss. And so associated with that loss, we have more bare ground, we have lower marsh elevations, as I said before. And so we're working to address these impacts by restoring the marsh with something we call thin layer sediment placement. So that's either with using hydraulic pumping to mix the sediment with water and to spray it back onto the marsh. And you can kind of see well, I guess I didn't talk about this photo so much, right? Like there's two outfalls. You can see the two outfalls. You can see the impact from the stormwater. This was actually last week on Wednesday, which was 2 days after we had pretty bad rains on Monday. So you can still kind of see that impact. And then a little bit in the background, you see a lot of goose fencing, herbivory fencing, and that's the project where we're doing our placement. So let me continue. And then Flushing Meadows, we had another, this is another project that we're working on. We're working with, there's a few things that are happening in Flushing Meadows, right? But I show this aerial to illustrate that we have Meadow and Willow Lakes, and they're surrounded by the Van Wyck Expressway, the Long Island Expressway, and the Grand Central Parkway. And so we have these roadways that are routing that runoff into these water bodies. So we have state jurisdiction here, we have New York City Parks jurisdiction, and then another complicating factor is some of the land is leased to our concessionaires, like it's leased to the U.S. Tennis Association because they use it as parking for the U.S. Open. And so ownership is very complicated in this area. Not only that, you have these places, this is just a photograph, underneath one of these expressways. I think this is the Van Wyck. And then you can see Flushing Creek below. And right now it's kind of this underutilized space, but it just illustrates, again, what this mess of highways looks like on the ground. And then, just the final slide, talking about the opportunity that we have here. I mean, Rebuild by Design just came out with a report that indicates that 70% of parks will be flooded by 2100, and really demonstrating how important it is to see parks as resilient and climate important, critical climate infrastructure. And so it's such a important aspect of being able to study the work and to fund the work that we do and to understand the opportunity that we have in parkland. But I also, want to indicate that we have you know, it's not just parks, it's people, right? The people are drawn to the parks, they're in these parks, they're using them and recreating in them. And we have also a robust volunteer program that is working in these parks. And so it's not only an opportunity to think about parks as infrastructure from a you know, structural perspective, but also thinking about social infrastructure and how we can improve the health of our city, both through looking at green spaces, but also building out our social capital.
I won't have you go back to the slide because I think it's a little finicky. But I recognize too that from the images you showed of Flushing Meadow Corona Park, as well as the, was it the 4 Sparrow Marsh, that like, and you see a fair amount of opportunity with space, right? We're like, oh, you can do something right there, but there's just so many challenges of being constraints, physical constraints, the jurisdiction, state DOT and parks, and just topography, all of it sort of like, unfortunately, working against us here. So even though that looks like there's a lot of space to do something right, it's just challenging, right? And I think that's like, I'm setting us up for a good segue here to the design side of things, because ultimately, you know, we do find the opportunities to make things right and actually find the space to do it the right way to manage this runoff. And so looking to you, Mohammed, to like sort of walk us through one of the case studies that you've been working on, you know, to do this.
So I'm going to do a deep dive into the Sunrise Highway Stormwater Wetland Basin that ME5 designed for Babylon out in Long Island. This originally started off as a watershed study in response that was commissioned under the New York Rising Community Reconstruction Program in response to Hurricane Irene and Superstorm Sandy. In our watershed study, we recommended about eight alternatives that Babylon could implement to increase resiliency against future storms. This was one of the alternatives that moved into design and eventually got constructed. During the study phase, which this schematic on the top left and on the right is from the study phase, we were estimating that the drainage area from Sunrise Highway, as shown in the cyan line, was about 16.5 acres. We believe that we could reroute the existing 48-inch outfall entirely through our proposed stormwater wetland, and we were also proposing to implement a manufactured pretreatment unit to then increase the water quality volume. You could also see we kind of show the maintenance driveway kind of in the hatched line here. And we envisioned that a car would drive down to service the micro pool as well as servicing the forebay. And you'll see later on that we realized what we thought we could do wasn't such a good idea.
Oh.
Okay, so once when we got into final design, we sat down with State DOT after going back and forth on full request to get additional records. Worked with State DOT, they were very helpful. We got a better understanding of the drainage areas for Sunrise Highway. We now realized that there was a flow split structure that split the flow in half. So there was an existing 48-inch out trunk main that split into two 36-inch mains. So we're managing, to the left of the flow split structure, we're managing half of the drainage area shown. And then to the right, the drainage area shown that's labeled A9, we're managing it in its entirety. So after the flow split structure, our drainage area increased to about 20 acres. It is almost entirely impervious. Here you can see some of the peak discharges and runoff volumes we were working with. Our design goal was to manage as much of the water quality volume as possible. The water quality volume, which is intended to improve water quality by capturing and treating runoff from small, frequent storms that tend to contain higher pollutant levels, was calculated to be 2.34 acre feet, which is about 102,000 cubic feet. At 30% design, we slightly changed things up. We believed we could route the entirety of the existing 48-inch main that's coming down through a pretreatment unit and send the lower level storm events through the micro pool, which would eventually spill over into the main pool. We changed around the driveway a little bit. allowing vehicles to drive down, make a right to service the micro pool, and then making a very hard left and turning down to get to the main pool. To get back out, we gave them a little bit of space to back out and come back up. At 50% design, we realized that backing up wouldn't really work when you're operating a vac truck that's pretty large. So we changed the driveway around, and now we envision that vehicles would drive around the pond in a circle. This way you could get to wherever you needed to, anywhere on site for maintenance purposes. We also moved the pretreatment unit to be underneath the driveway. We thought that the DPW would drive over, open the manholes, and then be able to service the pretreatment unit that way. At 100% design, we changed the driveway yet again. A little bit hard to see here, but when we get into the construction photos, it'll be a little bit easier. We kind of now moved the driveway and moved the pretreatment unit over to the right. This way, the folks who would be maintaining the unit had a little bit of more space to work. We also installed a diversion structure on the 48-inch trunk main, so we would allow for a higher level flows to bypass out into Carl's River, which is on the right. And now vehicles would drive down, make either a right or a left, and then have to back up to come back out. So what were we able to design in the end? The permanent pool is the permanent pool has enough storage volume for approximately 45% of the water quality volume. The 4-bay gets about 10% of the water quality volume, and that's following New York State DEC guidelines. At the weir wall in the riser structure, we're getting the about 1 acre-feet, which is approximately 90% of the total water quality volume. And at the emergency spillway, we do get the extended detention volume, which is CPV, at about 2.91 acre-feet. Here's just a schematic of the pretreatment unit as well as a photo during construction of them dropping in the pretreatment unit. Here's some construction photos that the construction manager took, and you can really see how the pond was constructed. You could also see the maintenance driveway over to the left, and there's a small space for vehicles to pull over to the right, and then they do need to drive down and back up to get back out. Here's some additional photos of what it looked like about 6 months after construction. I was hoping to get updated photos, but I wasn't able to get anyone out.
That's okay. All right. Well, thank you, Mohammed. And so I think we're all sort of adequately primed on this subject now, hearing from the data side of things, the watershed scale, city parks perspective, detailed design. And so wanted to just go over a couple of themes that we've touched on, maybe not the last one, but there's a few themes that are central to this in managing stormwater into the future, especially from highways. Collaboration, right, was discussed, and so we want to touch on that. There is the technology side of things. There is community engagement, and then there's also the policy. So got a couple questions here to sort of walk us through that on these random flashcards I have. So first up, and anybody can take this, but so how can different agencies collaborate more effectively to manage stormwater discharges from highways? And so I think we could all probably share on this, but happy to start whomever.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is they need to communicate, and they need to communicate effectively. I've been involved in a couple of projects over the years where there was a state highway, a county highway, and then municipal roads that all came together in one location. And they all did construction at a time and tied into each other's infrastructure, and none of the other players knew what the other ones were doing. So when it came to ultimately mapping it, nobody knew where it went or how it flowed or what direction it went in. So I think they always need to have that communication, and that's probably the biggest key that I see is between all of the agencies, and that could even go into permitting agencies for the work.
Yeah, and I'll add, that communication needs to happen early in the project, right? There was another panel that I I went to the battery one during lunchtime, and there was this image of a graph that talks about how coordination, making changes in the project. Early on in the project, it's easier to make changes. Later on in the project, it's much more expensive to make those changes, right? And so critical to get coordination early on, and then also to have capacity to do that. We need to, have more staff that can actually do that coordination. I think at New York City Parks, we're fortunate to have an interagency unit that their focus is on collaborating with different agencies. But even then, they have so many projects that they're working on. Like, we can always use more staff to be able to staff up that coordination. And then, me as a project manager doing wetland restoration, I'm often tapped to review projects, and that is not my core role. But at the same time, it's something that I do that's critical to the agency. So, I would love to see more staff that have the training to be able to do that full time. And then finally, people need to know how to talk to each other. Like, not only do they need to talk, but they need to know how to communicate. Like, how does the engineer talk to the planner, or how does the ecologist talk to the engineer? And so these problems are interdisciplinary, and so we need people who can speak each other's language.
So for the Carls River project, we were working for Babylon, and Babylon was going to construct the site and then eventually turn it over to state DOT for long-term maintenance. So one of the reasons why the design changed so much after design submission is we'd sit down with the DPW staff at Babylon, as well as someone from state DOT, and it was their maintenance staff, which we were sitting down with to kind of explain our design and why we thought how they could do things, and then they would say, okay, well, we really can't do this. So if one agency is constructing the asset, turning it over to another agency for long-term maintenance, I think it's key that you get them involved early on in the design stages and you get their input.
I'm just going to piggyback on that, and I'm looking at the clock too. We're running pretty long, but just as it relates to the interagency collaboration on the maintenance side of things, because it's such a big thing where I know maybe there's a couple of folks here are familiar with the New York City DEP's Cloudburst program, and where they're bringing water from the right of way. Some of these are maybe not highways, but they're large roads that have these sort of similar runoff issues, and bringing that to a centralized place like a park, for instance, to manage that stormwater temporarily. You're bringing that all there, and that site is also, the drainage from that site's going to that storage as well. And you can design it, but you have to keep the maintenance aspects, like a robust maintenance, thinking as part of the design to make sure that it's successful long term. So what we've seen is that there's a lot more of that, I think, happening these days, because we just don't want these things to fail. They're just too important. And so in big projects like what you showed before, it's probably a similar theme. So agreed. Okay, I'm gonna go through these so that there's also time for questions. Keep me honest on the time. So, okay, there we go. So, all right, gonna segue now. I don't have a nice segue, but it's a sharp one. So what technological innovations are being used to improve stormwater management and water quality monitoring? Bob, you sort of set the stage there already. If you want to maybe continue a little on that.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest keys is getting that information, because as you can see these projects where they're done in areas, you need to know where to do the projects. And when you looked at that map that I had with all of those outfalls on it, not all of them contribute the same amount. So there's ones that are worse than others. So that's where technology can help in continuous sensors or automatic samplers, and there's continuous, sensors can range from multi-parameter probes that are expensive to smaller ones that you can put a lot out. So I think the key is to use surrogates, use this technology to say, where are the higher levels coming in? So there are small, cheap turbidity sensors, relatively cheap, 900 to 1,000, but also have conductivity to them that could be used for other purposes of road salt and runoff. But you can spread those out, and they can record continuously for weeks to months. And getting that data in will capture all different weather events of where are the highest levels coming in. Are they in this part? Are they in this part? So you can kind of spread those outfalls out and put sensors spread out across that whole area and say at which point are the higher levels coming in. And then you can always deploy them and shrink that down. And I think one of the keys that I think a lot of people get bogged down in is water quality monitoring is using regulatory monitoring methodologies. Sometimes you need to screen first. And this is a great screening tool using the technology. May not be for a regulatory purpose, but it tells you where those problems are. So that's where you can focus regulatory monitoring in the areas that you need to do it, because that can be much more expensive.
Right. Yeah. Just maybe on this topic, quickly, is that, but that's, you still need the team to be able to like go through all that data and analyze it, right? We joked earlier about AI because it's like, oh, how do you integrate AI? And you can. I mean, there's
Yes.
there's just so much data out there to sort of figure. I'm gonna let you go ahead.
Right. Now, basically, when you see all of these, you know, you can get rain gauges, you can get rainfall amounts, you can get information from a lot of areas. And if you want to know if it's stormwater controlled, if you take all of that data by having it out for a month, you know, getting every 15 minutes, you will know time of travel. You could know a lot of information using those surrogates when you compare it to rainfall. But how do you compare it to the different amounts falling? You know, in 15 minutes, you might get a huge amount in 15 minutes, and then it might slow down and get a lot of rain. This is where I think in the future, AI could take all of this information and say, what is it showing us? Where is it showing us? What is the time of travel? How is it responding?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that is certainly, you know, on the horizon.
I'd like to think so. Mohammed, I'm looking at you. Is there anything on the technology side of things?
I'll just add, don't be afraid of the pretreatment units. There's a lot of different ones out there, and over time they have been getting more advanced, and the water quality volume benefits that they could provide are pretty good. There's different types. The one that we use causes a swirling motion, and all the sediments will settle down to the bottom. Now they have different ones that have nets, so if you're a municipality that maybe doesn't have access to a vac truck, you could look into a pretreatment unit that has a net, and if you have a bobcat or a small excavator, you could use that to pull the net up, and then you replace the net. So there's different ways, there's different types of maintenance that could be implemented with the pretreatment units.
Yeah, but that's where that conversation early on comes into play, right? Understanding the resources, the equipment that they have to adapt the design to that, right? Okay, awesome. All right, I've got maybe 5 minutes to get into like two big. Oh, sorry, Sandeep's got a question already. Okay, so the other themes that we just really briefly touched to is community engagement. So how important is community engagement in developing and implementing stormwater management solutions? Full transparency, Jamie and I are working on Flushing Meadows Corona Park with Waterfront Alliance as well. There's a big community engagement aspect to it, more than I'd seen. I mean, I've been working in engineering for a very long time. Not a lot of community engagement. And so this is one that was just felt special in reaching out and understanding the public. But I mean, maybe just to get your perspective on it.
Yeah, absolutely. The Flushing Resiliency Plan that Patrick is working with us and Waterfront Alliance and SCAPE also has been involved. They've actually led a lot of the engagement. But it's not just your typical like meetings, right? They had certainly had a series of meetings speaking to different the general public or users of the park, but they also had surveys that they put together, or they had pop-up events at the Hall of Science or at the Dragon Boat Festival, for example, trying to really get broad public engagement. And a lot of their initial questions were, how do you use the park, or what is your experience around the park? Not only that, using it as an opportunity not just to gain information from the community, but also to provide information as well about climate preparation and resilience and heat and what all the different impacts could be, and how an individual might experience it and also respond to those issues. So community engagement, I think, is just so critical to the work that we do here at New York City Parks. And we've done it on different levels, both with the resiliency plan, also on watershed planning. We had a Parlin River Watershed Plan that we developed in context with community organizations in 2020. And then also our partners like the Rain Coalition, for example, which is a group of community organizations, environmental community organizations throughout the city. They're partnering to steward, to provide maintenance, right, to address this maintenance issue, and to provide education and training behind that, but also to build a green workforce, right? So these jobs are meant to be pathways to permanent and good paying careers for these folks, and that's also really important. And finally, that picture that I showed underneath the Van Wyck, we're not only asking the community how we can manage stormwater better when we go out there, we want to be able to ask them how can we improve the park. So we're talking about co-benefits. We don't want just this empty space. We don't want to just improve for stormwater management, but also how can we manage stormwater and make it a play space for families, or also provide cooling from heat and be able to address many of the climate impacts with the limited space that we have.
Thank you, Jamie. All right, I'm going to go to the last one, speed round. What policy and regulatory changes are needed to address the challenges posed by stormwater discharges from highways? It's a mouthful. But policy and regulations sort of like is the net of it. Thoughts on I guess from the regulatory side of it?
In New Jersey, we have a highway agency permit that basically has everybody follow the same thing a municipality would. But I think one of the biggest issues came down to that I think would need to be changed would be how things are enforced and how things are inspected, because there are not a lot of inspectors to go around. Their jobs usually cover broad spectrum, where they do a lot of other inspections of wastewater plants, municipal systems, highway agencies. So when there are best management practices, or there are restoration plans, or there are things, how are those being followed up on, and how are they being tracked for effectiveness for the long term? And I think that's something that is going to be a change that would need to be made. Because you can do the best restoration in a project in the world, and we joked about it, ahead of time, but I've seen plenty of basins made where it says do not mow, and you go there a year later and they're all mowed down. Right. So who keeps track of all of that? Who follows all of that? And that's where from a policy and regulation side, that's a very difficult part that I think needs to be changed.
Yeah, I'll add that our regulations, the state regulations right now, they focus on volume and mitigating the volume of stormwater, but the chart that I showed earlier was talking about how our storms are becoming more frequent and more intense as well. And so the regulations need to adapt and consider in increasing intensity of storms as well. We're getting better at this, but I think policy still needs to work in terms of integrating the impacts of coastal and upland flooding. A lot of times we just keep them as separate things, but of course water is everywhere, right? So we need to integrate how we think about that. And then, we just need more baseline funding for parks and for public services in general. Like even DEP's Unified Stormwater Rule, which was fantastic improvement to our regulatory framework, but now we're asking, there's an advocacy effort to ask for positions to actually support the implementation of the Unified Stormwater Rule. So definitely look that up and check that out if that's something that is important. And then also, for Parks Department in particular, we have organizations like the New Yorkers for Parks, which has been doing really great advocacy to try to get at least 1% of our city budget to New York City parks, because it's so critical for our natural areas and also for general maintenance that we need baseline funding to be able to do this work.
Yeah. I know we're really short. I had a 20-minute monologue on this topic. I'm joking. But one thing I did want to just say is, what's making me hopeful is there's Local Law 41, which is the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines for people that may be familiar with it, but which will mandate for all capital projects, at least in the city here in New York, that they integrate, forward-looking climate projections, be it heat, coastal, stormwater. And so on the stormwater side, it makes me think like, at least we're going the right direction. That we're looking at that, acknowledging the fact that it's going to get worse, intensity is going to be greater, and adapting our new infrastructure to be able to hopefully accommodate that to the degree that we can, and then have that part of the capital planning process. So it's coming. So just trying to end on like a hopeful note as relates to that. And I'm like, I know we've got about 2 minutes at the top. So just wanted to hear questions from the group here, and happy to take any, I guess. Yeah, please.
Hi, I had a question about those rain garden type things that you showed like at the base of a pier. I think that's for an elevated track structure, and you said you can do the same thing for like elevated highways, obviously. It reminds me of like the rain gardens the DDC like put in like all over the city for things like stormwater management on roads and stuff. But so those are like very like I guess like regimented, and they have like 5 different types of storage solutions, and they've been pretty aggressive about actually constructing them and putting them in all over the city. Is it the same type of thing with those pier rain gardens, or was that just more of like a bespoke, like one-off innovative?
I mean, those were what I showed was more of a one-off bespoke thing. I mean, the program that you're describing is DEP's rain gardens that they've been putting out throughout the city and have been doing for a long time, and that is primarily focused on getting water off your streets and routing it through curb cuts into the rain garden or other.
Get
I think in
infiltration
unique-
basins and
yeah,
all that.
in unique cases they might pipe it too. But this is a way of looking at our overhead structures and seeing how we can manage for stormwater there. And so that still doesn't have a formal kind of built-out program yet, but there's an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I think on a site-specific basis, like if you need, obviously you need a certain depth for infiltration, and so sometimes these these taller boxes or planters, they're looking to provide that additional depth. So, and looking at these scuppers from the highways, in a couple places to see where that works, and I think they're still kind of piloting it in a way to see how that looks, what it takes to maintain it, if they're effective. So they're trying them out. I think that everybody's trying to be more creative these days.
Can I add something to that though, Patrick? Because
Yes.
I think it's also helpful in places where you have high water table.
Yeah,
like in
absolutely.
flushing meadows where you can't infiltrate, right?
That's right.
And in places where you have a brownfield or an EPA superfund, places like that where you don't want to go down into the ground.
Yeah,
So it
bad
helps
soil.
with the regulatory landscape.
That's right.
So.
Yeah. Great question. Oh, we have to wrap it up. Okay. Oh, I got Sandeep, one last. Yeah, and then that'll be it. Yep.
Great presentation. I think you guys really covered everything really well. And you came up with those 4 categories. And what I was just adding to that, because it's embedded in those 4 categories, what I feel, because all of you touched on it, that needs to be pulled out. And that's flexibility. I think like when you're dealing with stormwater runoff from highways, roads, and these hardscapes, it's one solution doesn't.
That's right.
Even that question, oh, there were 5 types and they just put one or the other, but we have to be flexible. And it's not just the technology, and I think Jamie can attest to that. When you plant, like with these rain gardens, I mean, we have cases and examples that, oh, we told the contractor they could do fall planting. Well, it snowed a lot and the city used a lot of salt.
That's right. And they're dead. Yeah.
We come back in the spring and there's nothing there. So it's always the flexibility that you have to be flexible.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of technology, but that's what
Yeah, that's a great point. And the toolbox is expanding, hopefully, a little bit every year, a couple of years, and just trying to find the ways to implement that in a dense urban environment to make it work. So, agreed. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming to this happy hour session that we have. Really appreciate it, and thank you everybody here.